We've all heard the glory of Viking conquests, the fearless warriors, the burning villages, the endless treasures. But there's a part of that story you were never told. When the longships came, kings lost their crowns, warriors lost their lives. But it was the noble women who paid the darkest price. Queens became captives, princesses became slaves, and their bloodlines erased forever. This is the hidden history the sagas refuse to write, the inhumane fate of noble women after Viking conquest. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is the side of Viking history no saga dared to tell, and once you know it, you'll never see their conquests the same way again. If you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this video, because history's hidden truths deserve to be heard. Imagine this, a once proud noblewoman draped in silk and gold standing on the balcony of her castle. She believes her walls are unshakable, her guards undefeatable, and her future secure. But in the distance, across the waves, longships cut through the dark waters like predators in the night. The Vikings have come. The air fills with the sound of war horns, and flames lick the sky as raiders storm the castle walls. The clash of steel, the cries of men, and the terror of servants running for their lives blend into one deafening chaos. And in the middle of it all, the noblewomen, queens, princesses, wives, find their entire world collapsing in a single night. For them, this isn't just the fall of a kingdom, it's the death of identity. Captured, chained, and dragged through the ruins of their once great halls, these women who once commanded respect now face a fate more terrifying than death itself. To the Vikings, they aren't people anymore. They're prizes, spoils of war, living trophies to flaunt, sell, or use to humiliate their defeated enemies. And here's the cruel twist. The higher their rank, the worse their fate. Because noblewomen weren't just valuable for their beauty, they carried political weight. Marrying or enslaving them wasn't random brutality. It was strategy. Imagine the humiliation of a king whose daughter or wife is forced to serve the very men who destroyed his throne. Some women were paraded as concubines in Viking households, stripped of their titles and forced to bear children who would grow up Viking, erasing their lineage forever. Others were sold like cattle in bustling slave markets across Scandinavia and beyond. Their names forgotten, their stories buried, and yet their suffering is rarely told. History books celebrate the raiders, the adventurers, the empire builders. But in the shadows of those sagas, noble women endured unthinkable torment, fates that silenced entire bloodlines. This is their story. And it begins with fire, chains, and the night their world ended. The nightmare didn't end with capture. For noble women, it was only the beginning. Dragged from the smouldering ruins of their homes, they were forced onto Viking longships. Imagine the scene. The proud daughters of kings, their wrists bound in iron, sitting among peasants and children, now all reduced to the same level of despair. The sea became their prison. The salt wind mixed with the stench of fear. Nights were filled with the sound of weeping, as these women realized they were being carried far away from everything they had ever known. And where were they headed? Not freedom, not mercy, but to the bustling slave markets of Scandinavia and beyond. Here's the cruel reality. Noble women were worth more than gold. Their beauty, their bloodlines, their refinement, these made them valuable commodities. Some were traded like jewels to wealthy Viking chieftains, others paraded in foreign markets, bought by men who wanted not just servants but trophies of conquest. But the fate of many was even darker. Some were forced into concubinage, kept in the halls of Viking warriors as living reminders of victory. Every glance, every command was meant to remind them, "You are ours now." Their children were raised as Vikings, their lineage erased, their identity rewritten. And yet, this was also strategy. Taking noblewomen wasn't only about desire, it was about domination. It meant silencing defeated kings, ensuring no heirs could rise to reclaim thrones. It was psychological warfare, played out in the most intimate, brutal way. What makes this even more chilling is the contrast. Viking women in their own society had freedoms, rights to divorce, to own property, to speak in councils. But the noble women they conquered? They were stripped of everything, living under the constant shadow of humiliation and despair. And so behind the epic sagas of Viking raids lies a silence filled with the cries of noblewomen who vanished into the mists of history. But their story doesn't end here. Because what came next was not just suffering, it was survival. And some of these women found ways, however small, to fight back against their fate. They were beaten, broken, and stripped of everything they once knew. But here's what the Vikings didn't expect. These noblewomen, once queens and princesses, carried with them something stronger than gold or power. They carried resilience. Inside the smoky halls of Viking chiefs, these women learned to survive. Some feigned obedience, hiding their true hatred behind lowered eyes. Others used cunning, earning trust, gathering secrets, slowly weaving influence where no one thought they could. And history whispers of those who turned their captivity into a weapon. A noblewoman could whisper in her captor's ear, shaping decisions, redirecting raids, or protecting other captives. Power didn't always come from a throne. It sometimes came from patience, from intelligence, from surviving long enough to strike back in subtle ways. But make no mistake, this survival came at a cost. Imagine the daily torment, forced to bear children who would grow up never knowing their mother's homeland. Imagine watching the world that once bowed to you vanish, as if it had never existed. Yet even in chains, some women fought to preserve their identity. They told stories of their lost kingdoms to their children, hoping one day the blood of kings would remember who they truly were. They passed down songs, names, and whispered prayers from their old faith, even when forced to kneel to Norse gods. And in the Viking sagas, their presence is almost erased. But here's the truth. The silence itself speaks volumes. Because the conquerors didn't want their stories told. To acknowledge their resilience would mean admitting that even in defeat, these women were never truly destroyed. This is the forgotten chapter of history. Noblewomen who endured fire and chains, but who carried their dignity in the smallest acts of defiance. And while some were lost to the tides of time, others left traces. Tiny fragments of resistance that still echo centuries later. But what happened when their will to survive clashed with the brutal world of Viking power? Did any of them escape? Did any reclaim their legacy? That's where the story takes its most shocking turn. For most noblewomen taken in Viking conquests, survival meant silence. But some refused to bow, and their defiance lit sparks of rebellion, sparks the Vikings crushed with merciless brutality. There are whispered tales of women who tried to escape in the dead of night, slipping from longhouses and running toward the forests or the sea. Some nearly made it until they were hunted down like prey. For them, punishment was swift and merciless. Escape wasn't just a crime, it was a message. And the Vikings made sure everyone understood the price of defiance. Others took a more dangerous path. Poison slipped into a cup, whispers that turned warriors against each other, or quiet rebellions within the household. These acts of resistance rarely ended well. If discovered, women faced public humiliation, beatings, or worse. But their defiance carved cracks in the image of Viking dominance. And then there were the rarest of stories, the women who managed to turn captivity into unlikely alliances. Some noblewomen, through sheer cunning, became trusted advisors or even wives to powerful Viking leaders. They didn't escape, but they carved out influence, protecting others in bondage and preserving fragments of their lost identity. It wasn't freedom, but it was power hidden in plain sight. Yet the cost of rebellion was always steep. For every woman who gained influence, dozens were silenced forever, their names erased, their stories buried, their lives reduced to footnotes in sagas that glorified the conquerors and ignored the conquered. But here's the haunting truth. Even the Vikings feared the legacy of these women. Because if their stories were told, if their strength, resistance, and quiet defiance were remembered, it would shatter the image of Viking triumph. It would show that even in chains these noblewomen carried an unbreakable spirit, and so history stayed silent. But silence doesn't mean absence. It means we must dig deeper to hear the echoes of their struggle. And in those echoes lies the final chapter. What happened to the last noblewomen carried away in conquest, and how their forgotten fate still shapes the way we view history today. Centuries have passed since the Viking longships carved terror into the coasts of Europe. Their sagas are filled with tales of fearless warriors, bold raids, and endless conquests. But listen closely and you'll notice what's missing. The voices of the women who paid the highest price. The noblewomen taken in those raids were more than just victims. They were daughters of kings, mothers of dynasties, symbols of kingdoms that no longer exist. And yet, their stories were deliberately silenced. Why? Because to the Vikings they were trophies, to later historians they were inconvenient truths, but silence doesn't erase suffering. In every forgotten village, in every abandoned hall, their shadows still linger. The cries of noblewomen torn from their homes, forced into lives of slavery and concubinage, still echo through the gaps in history. And here's the chilling truth. Their legacy did survive, but not in the way they hoped. It survived in bloodlines, in children who never knew their true heritage. It survived in fragments of oral tradition, whispers of noblewomen who defied their captors. It survived in silence, hidden between the lines of Viking sagas that never dared to name them. We celebrate the Vikings as raiders, explorers, empire builders. But behind every victory there was a human cost, paid by women who lost everything. Their kingdoms, their families, their names, erased. And yet even in chains they endured. Their resilience was quiet, but it was real. Their suffering may have been buried by history, but the truth cannot stay hidden forever. Because the inhumane fate of noblewomen after Viking conquests isn't just a footnote in history, it's a reminder. A reminder that behind every conquest, behind every tale of glory, there are untold stories of pain. And sometimes, those untold stories are the ones that matter most. So the next time you hear about the glory of Viking raids, remember this. For noblewomen, those conquests weren't triumphs. They were the end of worlds, and their silence still speaks louder than any saga ever written.